Hi, everyone. Welcome to our panel, We're Not in the Open Future Yet, Making Open Scholarship Accessible for All. My name is Teresa Schultz. I am the Social Sciences Librarian at the University of Nevada, Reno. My pronouns are she, her, and I also want to make clear that I identify as someone who does not have disabilities. I will be the moderator today for our panel, and I'm joined by my fellow panelists, Elena Ozebach, Talia Anderson, and Sue Kunda. We're going to be talking today about how open access and open educational resources really interact with accessibility. So what we mean by accessibility, we are using the World Wide Web Consortium's definition. Web accessibility means that websites, tools, and technologies are designed and developed so that people with disabilities can use them. And just some practical examples of this, it often means, people who are using assistive technologies such as a screen reader can properly understand and interact with digital media. But it can also mean, maybe someone who needs to use a keyboard to navigate a website versus a mouse, or it may be someone who really needs to make sure that who relies on clear color contrast to discern the differences between colors. And we know that accessible and accessibility can often mean different things in the OA and OER world. So we just wanted to make clear this is what we're talking about by accessibility. And so with that, and also we'll each be giving short presentations, but then we really want to spend the bulk of our time with this panel having a discussion among the four of us with our experience and just like where we think OA and OER are with accessibility and what is needed for better accessibility. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Elena.
Hi, everyone. I'm Elena Ozebach. I am the Health Sciences Librarian at the University of Nevada, Reno. So I'm a colleague of Teresa's, and my pronouns are she, hers. And today I'm just going to give you a very, very brief overview of two studies related to OERs and accessibility that Teresa and I conducted recently. So before we begin, I want to thank the ACRL's Research and Scholarly Environment Committee for giving us a grant to make these two studies possible. And just to give you an idea of what we did, the first study, we surveyed librarians who, just under 200, who work with OERs about their accessibility knowledge and their practices related to accessibility in OERs. And our second study, we actually looked at a random sample, about 355 open textbooks, and we evaluated them for accessibility based on a custom rubric we designed around the World Wide Web Consortium's Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or what we say WCAG, version 2.0 or 2.1. So just to give you a really, really quick overview of both these studies and some of the key findings. For study one, the survey, we asked librarians whether they consider themselves confident in their knowledge of accessibility. And we actually defined confident in a way that maybe is a little kind of not expecting people to be experts. We basically defined it as they have some familiarity with accessibility and they apply it sometimes or most of the time. And about, most of the librarians agreed with that they said that they were confident. So they didn't have to be experts to say that, but that they acknowledged they had some familiarity with accessibility. And then roughly half of the librarians said they do consider accessibility when helping instructors select OERs or write OERs, or when they're thinking of adding OERs to the collection. So while that sounds really great on the surface, that means half are not doing this. So that's an issue here. And the last thing I want to point out from this particular study is we asked them a lot of different questions about what would make accessibility easier to do when they're dealing with OERs. And the top three things that people identified were things like easy to use tools to make things accessible and to evaluate the accessibility of an OER they had in front of them, in-depth training related to accessibility in OERs, and community support, so like from other librarians, from other educators, to help troubleshoot any issues that they were encountering when they were looking at OERs and trying to determine if they're accessible or how to make them accessible. So study two, this was the one where we evaluated the actual open textbooks. So our rubric had 16 categories, but only roughly 14 or 15 of those actually applied to any one given format. And there were 4 formats we identified and worked with. So HTML websites, PDFs, Word documents, and EPUBs, and they were all kind of different. But we looked at, for each category, we tried to determine if the book failed in that category. And if they failed once, they it counted as a fail. And so across those 14 or 15, on average, each book had about 5.93 fails and a median of about 6 fails out of those 14 or 15. And we all looked at the individual formats and tried to see if how they performed and if there were some good examples. So like we defined like good books as having 3 or fewer fails and 3 or fewer fails in 3 different categories of the 16. And PDFs did the worst. They only had 6.5 of those percent of those books having fewer than 3 fails. And EPUBs did the best, but even then only a quarter had 3 or few fails. And Word documents and websites kind of fell in between those two. So clearly there weren't a lot of books in the sample that actually passed a lot of the categories most of the time. Next slide. So basically what we found from this study is that the books really ran afoul of accessibility in a lot of key areas. And to give you an example of some of the categories and some of the things that the books had issues with. So 80% of the books of the 355 failed to provide alt text for images within them, which is really a big thing if you're thinking of someone using a screen reader, trying to understand what an image is doing in the text and how it relates to the rest of the book. And then another issue that was really big is if a book had any tables, they were not properly coded or tagged in a way for a screen reader to understand them. So sometimes they were just images of a table copied into the book, which is really problematic. So 78.3% did that. And there are a lot of other categories that I won't go into, but some of them are just really key things for accessibility. So taken together, what are the implications of these two studies? Well, we would say that even though librarians do need to evaluate OERs for accessibility before they, help instructors incorporate them into their classes or add them to their own collections, because we can see a lot of these open textbooks do need help being remediated, but librarians need support. At least half of them say that they don't always consider these things. And one thing that came up is that maybe libraries should look at other campus collaborators like a disabilities resource center, IT, to kind of help them with this. But also we think that there is a big role for professional and scholarly organizations like ACRL to do more advocacy for making accessibility more of an important issue and to offer more training and resources for librarians who are needing to do this and who don't maybe have a lot of support at their institutions. And also just all of us really need to advocate for really good authoring platforms for OERs. So platforms that authors can use to kind of help them make sure before they submit a book to ensure that their book is accessible to everyone. And that's it. Thank you very much.
So hello, I am going next, and my name is Talia Anderson. I am the Scholarly Communication Librarian at Washington State University, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. I also do identify actually as having a disability. So I'm going to talk briefly about a survey that a colleague and I, Chelsea Leachman, carried out last year at the beginning of the pandemic, looking at accessibility in institutional repositories. So we created a survey of 7 questions that we were targeting towards institutional repository managers, asking them about their accessibility practices. And I would say that largely we were interested in accessibility of the contents of the repository, although there were some questions about the platform, and we drew some of that out as well. We distributed our survey both regionally and nationally and ended up with 79 respondents. And I'll talk a little bit about each of these questions in the next slide. So initially we asked people about their accessibility measures they were taking in the IR. And kind of one of the key findings from the survey you can see in this graph, well, about half of our respondents indicated that they were not taking accessibility measures. They were not remediating for accessibility. Other people certainly were doing different things, whether it was going back to older content and remediating for accessibility or focusing on policy creation and a few other areas that you can see here. Next slide. One of the things that we also did, because I am from a public land grant institution, we decided to do a somewhat unscientific survey of other land grant institutions, about 80 of them, looking to see whether they had specific policies for accessibility in the IR. And what we found is that about a quarter of the schools we looked at had stated policies. This again was at the beginning of 2020. I will note also that most of the ones we found were from Elsevier, and so they were mostly specific to the platform as opposed to being library specific policies talking about accessibility of the materials in the IR. Next slide. So we asked about types of remediation work and found that the most common thing people were doing was optical character recognition for the submissions that they were getting. Another common response is that people were not remediating once again. And then common as well, it was a little more common that people were looking at adding captions and transcripts for media, and less common that they were doing detailed work with PDF accessibility, which is understandable, to be honest, with PDFs. But next slide. For sources of funding, largely we found that libraries were funding this work, and that's kind of the story on this slide. And then finally, we asked about barriers for accessibility, and people talked about a range of things. Some of the most common ones, of course, were cost and time. People also discussed lack of training, lack of knowledge of tools. They also talked about frustrations with communicating with administrators and lack of support. Next slide. So finally, we had a few takeaways and kind of things that we wish we could have followed up on from this survey. One thing we were really curious about was how IR managers are thinking about triaging their work. With so many materials that are inaccessible, what are they pushing to the top of the list? How are they prioritizing things, and what measures are they wanting to take first? We also got comments from survey respondents about their feeling that this work was exploiting labor that is already, people who are already overworked. And we had questions about following up on that as well. We also wanted to think about how, in constructing these accessibility initiatives and IRs, how we can meaningfully talk about accessibility without resorting to a kind of checklist mentality, and really center the experiences of people with disabilities. And then because of, again, our survey respondents, we wanted to think about how we can really meaningfully talk to administrators about accessibility and invite their engagement in these issues and get the kind of support that is needed. And then finally, we wanted to think about how we can diversify our own teams to include people with disabilities who can give us perspective on these issues and help lead out in this work as well.
Hi, I'm Sukunda, and I'm the Scholarly Communication and Social Science Librarian at Western Oregon University, which is a medium-sized public liberal arts university. My pronouns are she, her. While Talia, Teresa, and Elena were conducting their research, I was actually kind of living that, because I am both the I oversee the OER stipend program on campus, and I'm also one of the IR managers. So I was becoming more involved in this. The first thing that, first area where I started working was in our OER stipend program. And in January 2020, we launched the OER stipend program, where faculty are provided funding to adopt, adapt, or create open educational resources. One of the stipulations of the stipend is that the materials have to be accessible. And I very naively thought that our Office of Disability Services would be able to help with this. So I never really thought that I would have to be that involved with accessibility issues. But they very kindly and tactfully explained to me that they don't have the time really to go through these items piece by piece, because they have limited staff and a pretty heavy workload as it is. But what they did do for us was they provided a basic webinar for our stipend awardees so that they would have a basic understanding of the things they needed to watch for when they were creating their OER. Then the second thing, in the spring of that same year, and because of the pandemic, the university decided that they would put our annual student research symposium online called the Academic Excellence Showcase. And this was the first time that it went totally online. They decided that the IR, which I co-manage, would host the presentations, and the presentation committee decided that the presentations needed to be made accessible. So again, I was kind of thrown into the accessibility waters. But this time I had some help because my colleague does also work in the IR. So we created detailed instructions for our students and then helped them individually as they needed. Then our faculty, after the Academic Excellence Showcase, started asking us, well, do our students have to also make their other work that goes into the IR accessible? And just kind of on the fly, without consulting anyone, we just made the executive decision that, yes, it was going to have to be accessible. So those two things kind of led us to where we are today. We are just currently starting to create standards. In fact, my colleague and I are meeting tomorrow to talk about these standards, which will definitely affect our students because we have students that regularly contribute work to the IR, things that most of us are probably familiar with, things like graduate theses, action research project, our history senior projects, oral histories, honors theses, and also the Academic Excellence Showcase presentations. Our faculty, on the other hand, tend to deposit items on a more ad hoc basis, and we really do an awful lot of the work for them. But one of the projects that we just started and we're really excited about is our Division of Criminal Justice just launched a new professional journal. And while we were pretty familiar with setting up the journal and working through all those processes, we hadn't yet thought about making the articles accessible. So that's one of the things that we'll be working with. One of our pilot projects is we'll be working to make sure these articles are accessible. Then the next thing that, next slide, please. Oh, it is next slide, sorry. Okay. And then while we're doing that, I'm also going to be looking into standards for our OER, and I will probably have to do more work as far as looking at those materials and making sure that they are accessible. And that seems just more daunting to me than the IR work, probably because it's me, but it's also because the materials, well, the materials in the IR seem to be, if it's one collection, they're all very similar, so you can get in a rhythm and checking them. But the OER resources that are being created are also different. For example, we have one faculty member who is creating an open math textbook, and which I know nothing about. Making math accessible, but she's very passionate about accessibility herself. And so she is consulting open universal design principles while she creates that. She is creating a pretext, which is a markup language that can retain the structure of mathematical research papers and textbooks. But after consulting with ODS, she was able to consult with our Office of Disability Services on this. They recommended that she convert it or make it interoperable with MathML because there's something about the screen reader not being able to really work well with the PDFs that are created by or generated by math pretext. So And I wish that I could say that we're also taking a look or eyeing our platforms as well as our content. But at the same time that we're taking on this work, we are moving, librarians are moving from 12 months to 9-month contracts. So we have to be very careful and really prioritize our work. And for right now, we're looking at our content first.
Okay, so now we have some pre-selected discussion questions, and we're just going to kind of talk about, how we feel about different things. So for question 1 for our panelists, how can you work with your faculty, students, and other open creators to make their work accessible? Who wants to go first?
I'll start with a little bit. I think it takes, that saying, excuse my cat in the background, it takes a village, and it really does take a village here. And fortunately, because I'm on a smaller campus, it's easy to get to know the different people. So I know the people in ODS, I know the people in the library. Academic innovation is also part of the library. So we all know each other and are working together to make work accessible. So faculty aren't just hearing it from one group, they're hearing it when they go to academic innovation for help creating their courses. Students are hearing it from, their faculty that they have to make things accessible. So that's one way.
Okay. Anyone else?
I can add something in. I think that it's important to be talking about this from the beginning. Often, at least with IRs, you're or even within working on an OER, when you're approached with a project, to bring this up is kind of a key thing to thread throughout a project. There's nothing worse than, I think, having something already created and then trying to go back and do the remediation later, both on the library side and on the faculty side. So I think having policies in place beforehand, so you know how you're going to approach the faculty member or the student and talk about what goes into a project of making something openly accessible online. That's something I would really highlight.
Elena, did you want to add?
Yeah, I think a big thing is just for librarians to have some, especially liaison librarians like we have at our institution, just some really basic training and accessibility, not even having to go too deep right away, but just so that the messaging is consistent. So if they, any liaison librarian gets a question from a faculty member, that we're all starting from the same point and saying that you need to be thinking about accessibility and just having some basic talking points to bring up in those sorts of situations, I think is important.
And one thing I'll add, and this is part of the reason Elaine and I have gotten so interested in researching accessibility and OER. Our campus got sued about 4 years ago, and so we signed a consent decree, and we are now under great legal pressure to be accessible. So on our campus, there is a huge push for accessibility. Any publicly available material must be accessible. So this is something where it's really coming from the top down at our university, and it's something that all professors, all instructors know their educational materials must be accessible. So it's really when you have that kind of a push, there's already training provided on a regular basis for our faculty, which I also think helps a lot when it's just kind of baked into the whole work of a university. Okay, so question 2. How can we best support, I'm sorry, we're getting kind of ahead on this. How can we best support each other, especially those with limited resources? I can jump in on this one if no one else wants to take it. I think one, again, as I think Talia mentioned, if our materials are born accessible, it saves everyone else so much work. If an OER is inaccessible, then whoever wants to adapt it will have to make it accessible. And then if we're not sharing those accessible versions, or if people aren't aware or can't find those accessible versions, it probably means repeat work is going to be done. So honestly, like Talia said, if it's just accessible from the very beginning, that's really the best. But also, I would really also add, I think that if we can share what we're doing, and if and you know, like, let people know what are best practices, new tools, and things like that, I think that helps too.
Yeah, I'll add in one quick thing is I've been interested lately in looking at kind of creative solutions for, let's say, a lot of inaccessible materials in a repository. And I talked to one librarian who had this great idea of making, well, this worked probably ideally during the pandemic, but she really wrote up a process for doing accessibility checks and then kind of put it out there kind of on the market, if you will, as a job that is just open for students to jump in and help with at any time. And so she was able to both involve more people in the accessibility work and then get a lot more done on going through a lot of documents that need help. I think those kinds of creative solutions are always helpful right now, especially when, you know, time and cost are both issues.
Sue or Elena? Oh.
I would say I agree. I think we're just starting to think about this, but we often hire students, and the call just went out for us to actually hire interns, and where this university pays for their work. So I'm thinking that we could hire an intern, do some training, and that student could actually do this work even over the summer when we're not available, because we won't be able to do it during the summers.
I will say 3 cheers for paid internships. Okay, let's go to.
Sorry, mind if I had one more quick thing?
Sure.
It's just kind of a pitch for a project I heard about kind of recently called Teach Access. It's apparently a cooperative between tech companies and universities, and they're really focused on providing, well, one of the things they do is they provide small stipends for faculty to develop accessibility into their courses, and then make those materials available as OERs. So I think we can market or, you know, tell faculty about that kind of opportunity, which I think is a great way of getting more courses engaged with these issues as well.
That sounds excellent. I hadn't heard of that before. Thanks for sharing, Talia. Okay. Question 3, how can libraries include more people with disabilities in our teams in making work open?
I think one idea is that if you have like a disabilities resource center who are already working with some of the students across campus who have disability concerns, that maybe that is a great collaborator on campus to get started with something like this, with finding student interns maybe who have an personal interest in this, and have disabilities themselves, who would be a really great voice to have on teams and to have as interns.
Yeah, and to follow up on that, I think you can hire, I would say hire volunteers, but you can get volunteers. Your Office of Disability Services might be able to hook you up with students on campus with disabilities that can test your materials for you. And of course, I think you need to pay them to do that. But I've heard, we haven't done it yet, but I've heard that students are often very pleased to be asked to be part of this type of work. So that's one area you could work with that.
I think that I would love to see universities looking at things like their hiring practices and the way that they write job announcements, and really kind of revisiting the the structures that we create within universities and thinking about how we're relating to disability communities with the structures we're creating. I think this is an ideal time given some of the events of last year to really expand the way we're thinking about diversity and inclusion.
I think that's a really good point, Talia, and this is something that kind of came up at our library the other day, is how a lot of libraries are actually probably in hiring freezes right now, or are having to cut positions, unfortunately. And so we're probably not, there's not a whole lot of hiring going on. And so for some institutions, this is actually an ideal time to really take a step back and look at our hiring practices and see how they could be improved. So thanks for mentioning that. I think that's great. Okay, question 4. What are some best practices for creating OER, well, I should say OER or open access materials that are accessible from the beginning? I'm happy to take the first stab at this. So I think Elaine and I, what we really found in our research is use the authoring tools, the formatting tools in your authoring programs. So whether it's Microsoft Word or something like Pressbooks, if you're using the pre-formatting stuff, so if you, instead of trying to increase your text size to make a heading, actually use the heading setting, the heading 1, the heading 2. The authoring platforms have a lot that can make it easy to make sure your material is more accessible. Microsoft Word, I know, has an accessibility checker that will actually run through your document to see if it's accessible. And there are tools like that as well for websites, such as, I think it's WebAIM. We use, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on the name of the tool we use, Elena, at our university.
You're thinking Site Improve. Yeah.
Site Improve, yeah. But there's a lot of tools out there. No checker tool is perfect because there's just always going to be things that you have to manually check for, but they are really good at kind of guiding you to making sure things are accessible.
And to follow up on that, I would say that if you do have a choice of where you could put up your book, to do some homework on some of the different platforms available to you and kind of see what how they perform in accessibility. So if you have a choice, you can probably go ahead and pick the best option available.
I have a question to follow up on that. Did you find in your research that there were platforms that were better than others? And if so, which ones? So
that's one of the things I think, you know, looking back, we wish we would have done is mark what is the platform for each book. So we didn't really track it. I can tell you there were certain platforms that we saw certain issues with. I don't know if there was any great 100% platform we found. Pressbooks had some issues with some of their templates. We noticed, so, you know, at the start of each chapter, chapter 6 will be the first thing you see and then the chapter title, but chapter 6 would be like a heading 6. And then your chapter title is a heading 1. So that's out of order. That's not accessibly compliant. It creates problems for screen readers. And so and it seems to be happening when you chose a template through Pressbooks. So things like that. I don't know if there's any perfect one. Microsoft Word isn't bad, but we've actually heard their accessibility checker. So just a word of warning, they've made it less stringent. It doesn't quite catch everything anymore, is what we've heard.
Okay, I also found an accessibility checker plugin for Google Docs and things. I can't remember what the name of it is though. I want to say Grack or something.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Grackle?
Yeah. What did you say?
Is it Grackle?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, thanks. And then I found one yesterday that is an accessibility checker for PDF called PAVE. And it looked really, really cool. And you can actually remediate the PDF as you go because you download it into this piece, into PAVE, and then it tells you what's wrong and it tells you how to correct it, and you can correct it on the fly and then download the remediated PDF. So it's pretty cool.
That sounds really interesting because I'm pretty sure we're all I'm gonna guess, Adobe Acrobat Pro for editing PDFs for accessibility.
Yes.
It's terrible.
Yes.
I can't say how good PAVE is for, you know, because I only just did a practice item, but it did win an international award several years ago for creating these types of things for people with disabilities. So it should be very good.
Nice.
Yeah, I will say that I used Pave some during this pandemic year because, I mean, long story, but I couldn't access my computer, my desktop computer for a while, and I don't have a license for Adobe, and that's a whole other thing. But my one experience is that in my experience, it ran a little slow, but it was very convenient having some kind of checker for PDFs. And then in terms of making things accessible from the beginning, one of the things I would mention is kind of, especially in working with authors, to maybe talk to them about ways that they can include accessibility checks or practices kind of within their standard workflow, like you know, talk about writing alt text as you go instead of coming back to it at the end, or talk about how when you use the headers in, say, Microsoft Word, that you can change the style to suit the style of the format of the font to suit what you want it to be, so you don't feel like you have to go back and change it later. I had listened to somebody recently talking about how, you know, people often maybe feel inconvenienced by these things, but if we can talk about ways of making it part of just the normal process of creating materials, I think that's helpful.
I think that's really true. I found that, you know, I used to abhor the formatting stuff, and I was like, why would I use this? And then I discovered why, and so now I've started making it just a part of any time I make a Word document. I'm using the headers, the subheaders, and all the pre-texting or the pre-formatting, and it's just, now that I do it, it's habit, and it's much easier for me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm doing it too. We're a Google school, so we use Google Docs. But recently we were writing up evaluation from promotion and tenure, and I noticed that we had used the title option instead of heading 1. And so I went and changed and just so proud of myself, because I felt like I knew what I was doing a little bit more. But now when I starting to create documents that I'm going to share with others, I do the same thing. Teresa, I go ahead and use the headings now, even though I hated them at first too. They make sense.
They really do. Okay, question 5. What can libraries and librarians do to advocate or help improve the accessibility of platforms?
Man, that's a tough one, isn't it? We use Digital Commons, who does have, like, I believe Talia said that in her research that they do have their own accessibility statement, and oftentimes people will, or universities will put that on their IR as their accessibility statement. And they're pretty good. I mean, they're trying. But I think that if we got together as a group and made more of a push and more noise, I think that would help move the work forward.
Yeah, I think that we have a great role to play here. I think that especially in kind of scholarly communication arenas, we're often positioned between sort of developers and sort of more of a front facing, public facing role. So I feel like we have a real potential to kind of communicate between, say, developers, needs to developers, and then also thinking about the needs of the general public, including people with disabilities. I've heard about some really cool projects, like with the Public Knowledge Project, the PKP. There was this really great effort by librarians, led by librarians, to create an accessibility group that really advocated with developers to institute accessibility practices in open journal systems. And I think they've made a real difference. You know, they've definitely gotten the conversation going with the developers in a new kind of way. So I would love to see librarians take this on more.
One thing I would have to say, and this kind of, I didn't mention this was really related to question 3, but I think we can push our consortiums that we're part of and our professional societies, such as ACRL and Spark, And I know I know this has been renamed, but the Open Textbook Network, I can't remember the new name of it now, but some of these groups that are doing a lot of work to bring libraries together and have instances that they can be part of some of these platforms. I think, like Sue was saying, that if we can come together, not just like one here and there, but like we're making a bigger push, like a united push, to let these platforms know that, hey, you need to be accessible. That really helps. I know we've been having accessibility issues with SpringShare and our LibGuides and whatnot. And we're finally starting to hear back from them that it sounds like, yeah, okay, we're gonna be able to make some changes, but it's been kind of tough when it's just been us. So, Elena, did you want to add anything?
Just to reaffirm everything that's been said so far. I think these are all great ideas. But yeah, I think our scholarly, as I said earlier, as part of our presentation on our studies, I think some of our scholarly organizations, and maybe not just with libraries, but partnering with like other academic organizations would be a great way to kind of push a lot of this forward.
And just because I kind of forgot to mention it before, I want to make sure. I would also say I think it's really important for some of those groups like ACRL and Spark and whatnot to really look at what they can do to be providing accessibility training when it comes to open access and OER for librarians. What can they be doing? Could they be providing some of that more in-depth training that maybe librarians would like to have? Could they even be helping to push for easier to use tools than Adobe Acrobat Pro, which is just a nightmare to use?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think I would echo also something Elena said about partnering with other groups. I think that there are other groups that have been working in the space for some time now, and I think we can really like lend our voices to existing work and realize kind of our role in doing that as well.
Okay, so final question. Any tips and ideas, this gets very specific, on making mathematical formulas accessible?
Yeah, that's a real tough one. I would say, first of all, that you probably should use MathML. It's I believe it's the standard markup language now being used, and it's supported by the W3C. If you can't use MathML, I would say that at the very least you should use alt tags for making the formulas into images and using alt tags to describe that image. That would be the very least. And because LaTeX, a lot of math is written in LaTeX, but I believe LaTeX can't be read by screen readers. So it does need to be in a different markup language.
I'm not completely sure, but I think that might not be true about LaTeX, or at least that there is a way of working with it where it can be accessible. And I'm basing this only, so I don't have firsthand experience with this. That's a huge caveat, but at Virginia Tech, Anita Walls has been, I think, working in this space and collecting resources and talking to people, which is something I dropped into chat. Virginia Tech has developed a preliminary kind of guide to pulling together some STEM and math accessibility resources. And my understanding, at least from their experience, is that they initially thought that LaTeX was not accessible and then realized that that was a good way for them to work over time. But again, I'm going to defer to others who have more experience with this. I think there are some cool resources, including apps that can also allow you to photograph an equation and convert it to an accessible tagged format and some stuff like that. So that's where I would start if I were working on this.
And so I did pull up the document, and I think maybe for our people watching, we'll try and include some additional documents where we'll include links to resources like this. So, because it was a long URL.
Yes, I love this.
Yeah. Anita's a great person to talk to, I think, for getting good connections. And I know SUNY has also been working, many others, I'm sure.
Any other tips? I have to admit, this is an area where I know Elaine and I have not had to do much work, so we don't have much to say.
Yeah, and I would just say that I have only briefly started dipping my toe in. So Talia, I would probably, I'm not sure I'm going to withdraw my comment about LaTeX not being a screen reader, but I would definitely look into that, because I could have read something old, or LaTeX could have been changed, or they could be talking about converting LaTeX to Math ML or something else. I don't know, but
Exactly.
yeah, that document that you provided is excellent. I also read a really good article about how to go about creating accessibility for math functions. So I can include that in our list of resources too.
Excellent.
Sorry, I can make one more kind of mention to, depending on the type of project that somebody's working on, if they're getting into kind of less math equations and more into sort of diagrams and those sorts of things, another project they might check out is the Flow project. They have been working with doing some kind of creative things like sonification, like taking images and making them cater towards sound, or representing them in different ways, essentially. So there are, I think, a lot of really creative ways of thinking about taking something that initially was inherently visual and then using other forums for communicating it. People can certainly investigate those types of options as well.
All right, well, that's about all we have time for. So thank you so much to all our panelists, and we hope this was helpful or useful to at least some people watching it. But otherwise, that's all we have today. Thank you.